Hello, everybody, and a warm welcome from me to a new episode of the Joy of Logistics podcast. We finished off quite strong last year, also the initial first year of the Joy of Logistics, and of course, we're going to continue to deliver such an incredible amount of insights and knowledge um, throughout throughout the whole podcast. And I'm actually pretty excited to to announce the first episode, the first show of 2023 already. And I'm also not alone today. Fantastic team, of course, with Jose, the tech guy. But maybe just some words about me in case you're listening the first time to the Joy Logistics. My name is Christoph. I'm now in the logistics industry for almost a decade. I my studies in economics and logistics, and ever since I've been working in sales, now as a key account manager, um, mostly on global shipping, especially ocean freight and air freight and everything in between and everything that comes along with it. Why do I host this podcast? Because of course everybody knows how a container or an airplane look like, but especially throughout Corona or throughout the pandemic, um, everything changed and everything is changing even more rapidly ever since. And I wanted to provide a stage for people, for companies, for concepts in order to grasp and understand logistics and everything that goes along with it a little bit more. So it's purely an educational platform, and hopefully you're going to extract some knowledge, some wisdom, some experience, some best practices out of it. And that's basically it. And today's episode is all about sustainability. Also last year with the AMH, with the American Maritime Highway, a lot of sustainability, a lot of ideas in order to reduce the amount of cargo on the streets, for instance, in order to max out the capacity utilization of a container in the US. And if you are following my frequent posts on LinkedIn under the hashtag Planet Logistics, if you follow that quite frequently, you also noticed that I focus a lot on um, more sustainable fuels, greener fuels, however you want to call it. For me personally, it's a very interesting topic, and I believe it is, and it's going to become even more a more vital topic throughout the world. No matter in the world where you are, where you're listening right now, um, the sustainability aspect is becoming increasingly important. And I thought, hey, why don't I pick up a great guest who has really some more knowledge or some deep knowledge about it, other than me as a novice, just reading all sorts of facts and stuff, but actually someone who really works deeply in the industry, and I believe I couldn't have find any better. So I'm actually pretty happy. I'm grateful that he's taken his time today, that he's there with us and joining me in a bit, which is Luke Johnson. And just to give you an idea who Luke is, according to H2 Green, Luke is a serial entrepreneur with extensive experience in energy and technology, and his duties took him from Australia, the US, even Germany, to the UK. And as H2 Green, I'm pretty curious what he's going to tell us and which insights he's going to share. So, a warm welcome, Luke. Thank you so much for joining, and I'm very grateful for having you today. Thank you.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me, Christoph.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Luke, I just read a little statement about who you are, but maybe you can also tell us a little bit more about you and also about H2 Green.
Sure thing. Yeah, so my background's fairly different from what I'm doing today. You may be able to pick the accent as Australian, but like you said, I've lived around the world, a lot of places. Turns out I'm terrible at languages, so Germany wasn't a long stop for me. But I started my career in oil and gas actually originally, so researching around some of the CO2 sequestration studies at the very beginning of that, sort of as a technology, then moving into oil and gas. And then after 20 years or so of being a geologist, I've now moved into hydrogen, where we're looking at developing hydrogen projects, specifically targeting some of those decarbonisation of transport fleets that are out there, the commercial fleets, the fleets that you're talking about, Christoph, that can't afford to stop, wait, and recharge. They need another solution to replace diesel. So that's what we've been doing. H2 Green's building a national network around the UK. We've started branching out into Germany. We have our first employee over there in Berlin. We've got 2 projects that are publicly announced at the moment. They're targeting about the capacity of delivering about enough hydrogen for 800 or so trucks at once.
Wow. I mean, that in itself is pretty phenomenal if you're asking me. So congratulations on that important step. Yeah, and I think you already touched base on a good question that I'd like to start with, because I believe a lot of people listening to this might be, oh yeah, that's interesting, hydrogen. Maybe I read here and there are some pieces about it, just like myself.
Yep.
I believe, and that's also one of the questions that came up to my mind with. It's pretty limited. So what about actually the source, or let's say the supply on that?
Yeah.
Can you give us some insights?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Christoph. It's kind of at a hilarious level of branding that's gone on at the moment with hydrogen. Maybe if we let's start off super simple to begin with. First off, hydrogen is actually one of the most important chemical feedstocks in the world. So, we produce around 75 million tons of hydrogen directly around the world per annum. And then there's an additional about 45 million tons that is produced along with a mix of other gases in various different chemical processes. The hydrogen's almost exclusively used as a chemical feedstock. 2 particularly important locations. One is in the refining of hydrocarbons. So if you imagine hydrocarbons are just long carbon chains with lots of hydrogen stuck on the outside. Well, we can break up those chains that might be very long that come out of the ground, very sticky and tar-like, and we can break them into smaller ones, throw a hydrogen on the end of that and make that into a more useful fuel. So that's how part of the refining process works. And it's a huge consumer of hydrogen. The other one that's really important is for the use of fertilizer. It's about 60% of the food that we all eat is only available because we create nitrogen-rich fertilizers, ammonia, using hydrogen as a feedstock. And that means that we need hydrogen globally just to maintain our population. Now, when we're talking about that hydrogen, you'll then start to hear people talk about colors of hydrogen, which is, just a branding thing. Let's just get that on the table right away. Hydrogen's colorless and odorless and doesn't come with different flavors. But what happens is we refer to the way that we create the hydrogen and we brand it around that. So most of that hydrogen that we're talking about is what people would refer to as grey hydrogen. And grey hydrogen is simply taking methane, putting it in a pressure chamber with water in a process that's called steam reformation. And the steam and the methane combine together, the carbon dioxide is ripped off, so the carbon's taken away, combines with the oxygen from the water, and then you end up with hydrogen. And that process is accounting for almost 100% of all the hydrogen produced in the world. There are a couple of other flavors along that lines. There's the grey one we mentioned, but there's brown or black. You can do the same thing with coal as you can do with gas. So that's what used to make the old town gas. So if you think about those giant old gas holders that used to go up and down and holding town gas, that's how they were fed by essentially turning that coal into hydrogen as the main source of energy. But then we start getting into the more modern ones where people are starting to talk about what we're doing differently. And that's the colors like green, you might hear blue. And then you get into all of these crazy rainbows of turquoise, green, pink, yellow, red, all of this other kinds of crazy colors. But maybe I'll just start with the blue. That's the easiest one. And I mentioned, so I mentioned the beginning of my career was in CO2 sequestration, right? So as a geologist, I was out there trying to figure out how we could get large volumes of CO2 permanently disposed of by putting it underground. And that's that if you do that with the process of creating gray hydrogen, we then go away and brand it as blue hydrogen. So we say, oh, well, the CO2 that was normally vented off into the atmosphere, now let's capture that, put it into some other way and dispose of it. And one of the leading ways of potentially doing that is injecting it underground into some of the aquifers that are under there. There are also some really interesting opportunities out at the moment with the development of using that CO2 as actually a useful product, where people are putting it into creating carbonates so that they can actually use it for cement processes, which is pretty cool. You may rarely hear of something called turquoise hydrogen. I'll try to run through this one quickly. It's another way of taking natural gas and creating hydrogen, but instead of CO2, they end up with solid carbon. Doesn't really work yet. Might work in the future. A bit out there, but the main one that people hear about a lot at the moment is green hydrogen. And what green hydrogen is essence. Let's go all the way back to high school, mate. Let's go right back to when you were sitting there in your high school lab and you put an electrode in a bucket of salty water and you get bubbles at either end. One end will be hydrogen, the other end will be oxygen. And if your teacher was capturing that and then puts a lighted stick in there, it makes a nice loud pop. So that's electrolysis. Super old. It's actually 150 years ago that we figured that out. You can create hydrogen by splitting water apart. And interestingly, you can recombine the hydrogen with oxygen from the atmosphere and do the opposite and revert. Do the equation backwards and generate electricity. And that's the thing that people are really excited about with hydrogen is, can we generate onboard electricity by taking hydrogen in a cylinder, combine it with oxygen from the atmosphere, generate electric current and power an electric drivetrain. And it's not crazy science. The Apollo lunar landings, they were all powered by hydrogen fuel cells because they had an enormous big rocket full of hydrogen and oxygen. And if you go back and watch, have a look at the Apollo 13 movie when Tom Hanks starts freaking out when they've got that gas leaking out the side. So the big problem was that they didn't have any source of generating power. And so they weren't able to run their computers, which were, about as powerful as your wristwatch would be today. But they didn't have enough electricity. So it was a fuel cell using hydrogen and oxygen that was on board that. And it's, it's an old technology. So that's what we're looking at using it for today in the decarbonisation journey.
Wow. I mean, I didn't know that. I didn't know that the Apollo 13 was actually really using fuel cell / hydrogen. That's pretty interesting. So, basically, in a nutshell, I think it's similar to EVs as well. The concept itself is new. The way to power, whatever it's a train or a car or whatever, in that sense, is the same. So you're just advancing, optimizing this already known formula. Is that a correct way of putting it?
Yeah, I think so. And let's be honest. Well, the reason why we're doing it, right, is we need to replace petrol. We need to replace diesel. They're immensely powerful fuel sources, and they're very easy to handle, and that's fantastic. But we can't afford to continually pump that CO2 out into the atmosphere any longer. So we have to find an alternative. And in transport, it's pretty hard to decarbonize it because we can't just plug it into the power point with a long extension cord and drive down the road. And as much as people are looking at some interesting concepts of saying, could we provide like on some of the rail systems, like a third rail that you could pick up electricity directly from a conductor onto it, that doesn't seem to be very feasible in most applications. So we still need to replace that onboard petrol and diesel energy source with another source of energy that we can move around. So I personally have a battery electric car, and I do very few miles in a day. So for me, I can charge that vehicle up, drive off, and I've got plenty of range. no emissions, and I, my power is all contracted through renewable energy, so I can comfortably say that I've got a zero carbon footprint for that component of the travel. But when we come to when I'm talking to commercial fleets, friends in your industry with the logistics side, they can't afford to stop and wait. They're not going to sit there and wait for 8 hours to recharge a truck, because if that truck's not moving, it's not making money. And what hydrogen could do is refuel it and get going again.
And what's pretty interesting also, I mean, of course, if also some of the audience, I believe a lot of those folks are already somehow following the transportation, whether it's just private or public or commercial transportation, right? And of course, you hear all sorts of different studies, whether it's pure electric, whether it's hydrogen, ammonia, a mix of all of them, or as you already alluded to, the those I'm lacking a word here in English. Maybe you can help me out. Like, as you know, the trains where you have those antennas,
going overhead power, and
thank you. Overhead power. And I know that there actually is a overhead power trial highway part, at least in Germany, where they're actually trying to do that. But at the end of the day, if we think about it logically, for a train, this makes sense, because it mostly stays on the same track. It doesn't really go, off-road, so to speak, right? But for a truck, just imagine on a highway, and there's maybe a construction work over there. Maybe there is just a slower truck that he wants to overtake. Maybe there is also an accident. Who knows, right? So he has to switch lanes. So is it really? I was always wondering: is this really a concept to say, like, okay, you have your antenna up, so to speak, to grab the electricity out of the overhead charge, so to speak? How you're intending to switch their lane? I mean, if you're driving downhill, I don't believe that that's an issue, because you just lower the antenna, you just pull over real quick, and there you go. Correct. But if you're going uphill and you take some, or you have some quite some distance or some time until the truck is fully switched the lane to the new overhead line, so to speak, in order to elevate his antenna again. I don't really see that that's a feasible thing on the commercial side. Do you?
Well, I think in all honesty, they wouldn't be just directly taking that power and running an electric motor. They almost certainly would be charging an onboard battery or an onboard supercapacitor, and then that would give them some of that carry. They'd be able to move off those lines for a period of time. And we do see that, actually, interestingly enough, is starting to be developed particularly in the rail industry, like you mentioned, when we're talking about trying to replace where there are diesel locomotives. So the UK is way behind Europe in terms of electrifying its rail system. After living in Germany and now living here, it's like going back 100 years.
Oh, really?
Yeah, well, they talk about the UK having the first railway system in the world, and it still does. So it's pretty woeful. But apart from the fact it doesn't work, well, no, it's not true. It does, but it could do with some upgrades and modernization. But there's got a lot of diesel traction, right? A lot of the long distance is powered by diesel locomotives. And those locos, when we look at replacing those, they're either going to have to do a massive overhead electrification project, which the government announced and we're moving forward on, and then COVID hit, and now governments are broke and they can't afford to do it anymore, and it's it's expensive to do that, because you think about it, you cut tunnels through hills, you built bridges, and they weren't designed for that extra clearance to have these things above them. So if you're going to go and retrofit that, you've got to go back and dig the roof of the tunnel a bit taller, and reinforced bridges and all of those kind of components. So one way of doing it is by having essentially short patches of overhead transmission, and then onboard battery systems. So you could be recharging and using power when you're connected, and then in the gaps in between, you're using a battery source or a capacitor source to do that. And I think what you're referring to with the road vehicles would be much the same. Interesting enough, if you go to Seattle, they've had road trams, they call them, I think, but they're essentially like a double length connected bus that drives on the road and it's connected to the overhead. In those situations, they are direct
Switzerland
wire.
as well.
Yeah. So they're direct wire connected, and if they lose connection, they stop. And then the guy, the guy comes out with a little rubber pole and tries to hook it back up. Well, sparks fly everywhere. So yeah, that's not the right solution in all applications. But the difference with a battery system, right? If we wanted to say let's do onboard batteries, and the classic one is you see the Tesla Semi being talked about a lot, and Elon slightly exaggerated claims, which is so unusual for Elon Musk to overstate things. But let's just say, he's out there telling us we've got the semi truck coming. And it's important to note that they haven't told you the weight of the battery unit in any of that. And the big reason for that is you can recalculate it yourself. And he must have between 6 and 8 tons of just lithium batteries on there, let alone all of the battery pack that has to be associated, all the connections, everything else behind it. So that has to come off the back of your truck, right? Because your weight of your truck is limited not by the acceleration capacity, but its braking capacity. So that truck has to be able to safely stop so that it can be a responsible road user.
Right.
So that's the issue with the trucks is that to get anywhere near the range, first off, you've got to have that enormous amount of batteries. The second point, this is one thing people talk about with infrastructure, is that the cost for upgrading our electrical grid to receive a power charge from one of those things is horrific. A lot of people don't realize this, right? So Musk has come out and he said, I've got my supercharger network. Here they are. You can go and park your car and charge up. And that's awesome, right? They work really great. But they're kilowatts. When he's talking about the chargers for the semis, he said megawatts. So megawatts, 1,000 times bigger. First off, these are the old, if you're on a substation, you turn on a megawatt connection, it's the old Frankenstein lever, right? It's the giant big thing because it arcs like a demon. So that's big power, right? That's not what you want to be playing around with. They're also a cable that's like this, absolutely massive. But besides that, the grids, you can't just turn on a megawatt and turn off a megawatt without the grid falling over. It's not designed for having all of these on off, at that kind of scales, because that's really industrial level at that point. So upgrading the infrastructure just to supply electricity for that is actually really expensive. And this is one of the weird parts. There's been plenty of studies done. The UK's issued one, Scottish government issued another one more recently, where they've done the cost analysis of saying, what if it would cost the population to provide a hydrogen network for commercial fleets versus this complete electrification? And the cost of electrical grid reinforcement was significantly more than building a brand new hydrogen network. And that's just simply because, you're talking about upgrading all of the transmission systems, all of the substations, everything else that's out there. And so that's another potential benefit for us as a society.
Plus, if you allow me to jump in here real quick, Luke, just today I also read a statement in which DP World in Germany, they made it to obtain 40 fully electrified trucks, which is nice. But we also got to keep in mind that, which you already alluded to, they must somehow have a dedicated recharging station, because speaking from my experience down here, southern Germany, bigger Stuttgart area, I have yet to see a regular gas station which also offers the connectivity or the capability to actually recharge a semi, because you don't. They don't fit in those small spots of a car, right? So I've also read in a book earlier, which was making sense to me, that because we do already have the gas stations all over the cities, villages, highways, etc. Hence, it's, at least based on that and on that idea, on that theory, it's you already have basically the grid point, so to speak. You only have to add the hydrogen element to it. Now, I know this probably sounds way easier than it is in practice.
I wish it was
right?
that easy, to be honest. Yeah, that'd be great. But go on. Let's just. Yeah.
And because this just comes to my mind now, talking about all the infrastructure stuff that you also already alluded to. So at one point, we also make sure that, especially the commercial vehicles, and we're talking about thousands and thousands of trucks just alone in Europe, and given the different typographics, because meaning in the Netherlands, for instance, are pretty flat. So I suppose that's maybe easier, for lack of a better term here, to establish a certain network or to haul freight on EVs alone, for instance, right? But if you're talking about your having a semi, a fully loaded semi with weighing around about 40 tons, everything together, including the cargo, etc., and he's pulling up the Alps. At one point, he also has to refuel his energy juice, so to speak, and how do you spread the infrastructure out there?
Yeah.
Let alone Australia, for instance, with the outback.
Forget about Australia.
That's a whole...
Yeah. Yeah. I'll tell you a funny story about that one day. But so the reality, I think, in a lot of those situations, we talk to a lot of fuel stations, right? And one of the things that they show interest in is the concept of that a hydrogen vector could give them a reason to exist in the future, because they've done exactly what you've spoken about. They've gone out and they've tried to figure out if they can put some electric charge points in there, and a lot of them can't. And it comes back to the point that they were never designed to have that much electricity. And the typical way that a grid will work is if you're the person that asks for the upgrade that requires them to put in a new substation, you bear the cost. And they'll build that substation with a bit of extra capacity. So the second person who comes along is like, great, thanks very much, I can just pick it up. But if you're you're on the Autobahn and you've got a a lovely big forecourt there, it won't have the power connection to be able to supply that. And that's where hydrogen can come in. And I think one of the other aspects about hydrogen that's quite interesting is that we don't have to essentially cause that stress on the system. You can be producing the hydrogen constantly. As opposed to turning on a big charger and charging your vehicle, then turning it off, and then suddenly the grid's got to deal with the fact the power's been disconnected. And so that part of it is quite different, I think. And I think when you look at the total cost for us to decarbonize, that's one of the potential advantages.
Now, since I believe there are a lot of folks also listening, not solely limited to over-the-road transportation, meaning semis, etc. And I've also been reading a lot of in terms of hydrogen. Is that something for ocean vessels, etc.? And just the other day, I believe you saw that post as well. Valencia in Spain actually received its first hydrogen delivery, where they also intend to somehow create something like a refueling station for vessels. What's your take on that? Do you think that hydrogen also might become something usable for vessels?
Yeah, look, that's a really good one to think about. I think I've spoken about this a number of times in different sort of contexts. First off, my recommendation would be that we shouldn't rush to necessarily decarbonize the marine fleets. When we look at it, they're huge vessels, right? They pump out huge amounts of CO2 and they use a tremendous amount of fuel for a ship. But per kilogram of goods moved, they're super efficient. So we've got plenty of other things that are actually causing a bigger impact on terms of CO2 by essentially that last mile delivery is far more carbon intensive than the first few thousand.
Right.
So so there's that part of it. But with hydrogen on a ship, the first thing is no, it can't be hydrogen, because you won't be able to store enough volume of hydrogen on board a ship to do those kinds of distances. Hydrogen by mass is super energy dense, so that's great. That's one of the reasons why they used it in the rockets, right? Because it's very energy dense for every kilogram of hydrogen that you carry. The downside is it's darn hard to get it to pack together into a nice small location. It's the smallest atom in the universe. It wants to be as far away from itself as it can, and so it's really hard to compress the damn stuff. And And you'll hear like, Daimler, for example, have spoken a lot about using liquid hydrogen. And that means you have to keep it super, super cold, right? And when we say cold, it's using about the equivalent of a third of the energy that's in that hydrogen is needed to get it down to that kind of temperature. So, it adds a whole nother problem about energy efficiency, right?
Yeah.
But we spoke a little bit earlier on about probably the molecule that we're going to use, and that's ammonia. So ammonia is really easy to manage, right? We ship that around the world all over the place. Big part of the fertilizer industry, big part of chemical feedstocks. It's one of the most moved commodities, secondary to petroleum products in terms of, chemical shipping. So basically, it's super easy to move ammonia. It's a nasty damn little molecule, actually. It's quite, you don't want to breathe it in. It's not good for you, but we can contain it. We can hold it. We do that regularly, right? But that molecule is very energy dense now. And that's one of the great advantages of it. It's one of the reasons why it's such a powerful fertilizer when it's used the right way. And so you can put it into ammonia. You could either potentially consume the ammonia directly, or you would decompose the ammonia back to nitrogen, which is 80% of the atmosphere. So you just vent that. And it's not a greenhouse gas, of course, because it's most of what you're breathing right now. And then you keep the hydrogen and use it like a fuel cell. So you could do it on board. You probably won't do that. I didn't think you'd do that on a vehicle, although I just saw, if you track my LinkedIn, I was just on Twitter, I think I was just tweeting about an ammonia truck. So it's using ammonia as on board directly. So you can do it that way as well. And then you kind of get away from all these problems, because you only have to use about I can't remember if it's about 60 bar to make it liquid at room temperature. Whereas hydrogen, you can't liquefy it at room temperature. You have to chill it. And so we typically store gas pressures of 350 to 700 bar of pressure for onboard hydrogen, which is pretty tough. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really a number. I mean, just to finish off the modes of transport off. By the way, I appreciate those insights. There are indeed a lot of things I didn't consider in the first hand. So definitely a lot to learn from me tonight. I just read last week that also Airbus, in terms of airplanes, is working on an idea, or let's call it a pilot turbine that would solely move on hydrogen. So are we flying in the future on hydrogen only? What's your thought on that?
We used to, right? They used to fly them across the Atlantic. They were slightly big and slow, but the old Zeppelins were hydrogen. But we're not going to probably go back to that phase. But no, in the jets and in more modern examples, yeah, there's quite a lot of interest out there. I think in those applications, you're talking about a really high value fuel at that level. So that's one that you'd probably chill and get to liquid state, and then you've got the energy density that you need. I think there's a lot of interesting thoughts around that. There seems to be a lot of promise in it. There's certainly some really cool looking innovations that are happening out there. If I wanted to be really skeptical, though, again, coming back to saying what's the priority for us to try to decarbonize as a species, right? So we can do things that make us feel good, or we can do things that are effective. And the airline industry, again, is not a huge contributor to the CO2 footprint. So it might not be the first place that I would rush to go and do. It's also pretty hard to get new planes approved and all the rigorous safety testing that goes on. So I think it'll be a little while. Where I think, though, you'll probably see hydrogen playing a role is in the generation of e-fuels. So we can create fuel, right? We can make methanol and ethanol, and we can do all of those kinds of components. All of these things can be chemically produced. What you need is carbon, and you need hydrogen. And so we can get carbon. That's something we can get hold of. And if we're producing hydrogen, then then we've got a net zero type fuel. If we're creating it, burning it, even venting it straight into the atmosphere again. But if we were pulling that carbon out of the atmosphere in the first place to create it, then that's a zero sum game. And then you've got something much easier to use. You keep using conventional jets, you keep using conventional fuels. You basically make a bio kerosene or bioethanol, and then it's a liquid. It's easy to handle. So I think my suspicion is that's probably how airlines will go.
So, well, first of all, I really love that sentence. We can do things that make us feel good as a species, or we can be effective. I really love that. I mean, wow. I'm gonna borrow this, Luke.
Yeah, go
Credits
for
are
it.
all to you, but
Doesn't
ooh,
always
yeah, I
make you
like
popular.
that.
Yeah, but it's I mean, let's be honest. We've got a finite amount of interest that people are willing to pay to do this decarbonisation, and if we waste that interest and we waste the amount of energy, the capital, and people's willingness to change, to do something that's not going to impact the end answer, wouldn't it be better to do it in a smart place first?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm with you on that for sure.
Hmm.
So, but what you were just saying. So at the end of the day, or if we bring it down bottom line, what you were just saying in a nutshell is that maybe hydrogen is not so much the fuel, talking about vessels and trucks, etc., but much more the, let's call it the raw material, for lack of a better term, in order to create those sustainable fuels. Is that correct?
It might be. I might be. I think in
Mm-hmm.
applications, like I think we're seeing some pretty good progress around using hydrogen directly as a fuel in trucks.
Mm-hmm.
You've got
Mm-hmm.
even passenger vehicles. The Toyota Mirai runs on hydrogen, and that's all feasible and that's all doable. And in essence, it's because you need to replace a 300-liter diesel tank on a truck would
Mm-hmm.
need about 2,000 liters of hydrogen volume at 350 bars. So it's bigger, right? It's not quite 10x.
Mm-hmm.
But if it was batteries, it would be 6,000 liters, or eight tons. So the difference is
Wow.
that
Mm-hmm.
the hydrogen will weigh, I think it's about 38 kilos instead of 300 liters of diesel, which will be 250 kilos or so. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
exactly how much lighter it is in
Mm-hmm.
water, but so I think they'll work in those applications. When you get to the marine vessels, they just need a bigger volume. So I think it'll be high, it'll be ammonia, but you've also got a lot more room to play around with in the ship's hold to be able to, to break the
Mm-hmm.
ammonia down and use it. And then I just don't know enough about airlines, mate. I think that's going to be beyond my ken as a geologist. I look down, not up, usually. So I'll leave it to the smarter people than me.
I hear you. But maybe I believe there are also some people thinking like, oh man, what Luke is saying, this is fantastic, but and it makes sense, we decarbonize logistics or shipping industry, however you want to call it, and I think also an awesome side effect is also that not only we are reducing the amount of carbon dioxide being omitted, but emitted, sorry. But there are also all sorts of other different nasty emissions, like what's
Yeah,
that? Sulfur, whatever.
yeah,
I can't recall all those chemicals. So, but
yeah.
this would also be something that we would get rid of if we would use more sustainable fuels, right?
Yeah, actually, that's a really interesting point. So this is one I'm trying to crack. How do we solve for this? So one of our projects is at a port in the south of England, at a town called Shoreham. So it's
Mm-hmm.
it's one of the it's in the top third of the ports in the UK, but right at the bottom of that top third. So it's not a massive port, in terms of UK port scales, but a very busy, active commercial port. And
Mm-hmm.
we're building a hydrogen hub there. And one of the parts that when we're engaging with the local community about this, the first thing they do is they say, "Oh, well, you're going to make noise, with putting new industrial equipment there producing
Mm-hmm.
hydrogen." And my answer to them is, well, yeah, there'll be some noise associated with any kind of facility. There's no doubting that. We also want to put up wind turbines, so they're going to cause, visual and even audible impacts. But when you walk around the port, which is on a lovely beach, the first thing you notice is all of those diesel trucks with putting the foot flat to the floor, and they're accelerating the heaviest part of their load from a standing start up to, not even, 20 or 30 miles an hour, 50 kilometers an hour.
Mm-hmm.
And that's making a heck of a lot of noise at that time, but it's also spewing out huge amounts of particulate pollution. So all of that diesel that's being ineffectively burnt at that early phase of the RPM cycle as they're cycling through all of those gears, That's all coming out as soot. And it's well proven that diesel particulates is a big reason why the EU is trying to get rid of diesel engines in general from passenger vehicles. They're not good for your health, right? And they've got a big impact. What I'm trying to do is figure out how the hell I get the community to, if they're going to benefit from that, why does the trucker have to pay for all of that? So if they're the logistics company is sitting here saying, well, I've gone and use this new fuel, doesn't produce particulate pollution anymore, but they're not getting any benefit for that. But the community does, and that's a good thing. The output of hydrogen fuel cells is water. It's so that's fine. But you've got no noise. You've got electric powertrain taken off. You've got fast acceleration. That's one thing I think on the logistics side that folks don't quite yet appreciate. We did some work for a logistics firm in Aberdeen, and they have essentially, it's a North Sea operation, right? So they basically pick up heavy stuff that's come off the North Sea at the docks, put it on the back of a massive truck, even though it looks like it's mostly empty, but it's just an enormous bit of steel usually. And they accelerate that thing 30 miles an hour through a town that's full of roundabouts and stop signs and traffic lights. And we simulated what would happen if we substituted that diesel motor with an electric powertrain. Doesn't matter if it's batteries, doesn't matter if it's fuel cell, but just that powertrain that has instantaneous torque. And we saved about 8% of their travel time in the day, because instead of accelerating at snail's pace as they get up and speeding, finally going, they would just be accelerating like a car. And if you put that across their whole fleet movement and then think about, how that impacts traffic flow in the community, everyone avoids trucks, don't they? You see a truck in the distance, you're going to try to go around it because that thing's going to be slow. What if it wasn't? That would make another significant difference. And if the traffic flow is more efficient because you don't have those traffic snarls, that again reduces carbon footprint, even for the vehicles that are out there using combustion engines. So these are tangible benefits we need to talk a bit more about.
Absolutely. I mean, that's fantastic. I mean, a save of 8% of in essence also driving time. I mean, that's also beneficial for the driver and for the company, right?
Yeah.
Because he most likely will also be home earlier.
But let's be specific, right? That's that specific use case, because in that case, you had a fleet operators who went from the docks 8 miles away to their warehouses and back again. And they were doing that through that, essentially normal roads. If you are someone who's transporting, goods across, the European continent on the highways, that's not going to be the same kinds of savings, obviously. So I think the application is important to consider in that.
Yeah, and I think also, as you already alluded to, not only the application as such, meaning the use case, but also the conditions around it, I believe, right? How long is the distance? What type of traffic are they're likely to encounter, et cetera, because obviously this all impacts the whole materia, so to speak.
Yeah, actually, and those external factors are important too, even when it comes to passenger cars, right? So my battery electric car supposedly got 280 miles of range at full charge. If I go out on the highway and I do, 70 miles an hour, and that's really inefficient for those vehicles, I can probably get, 180 kilometers out of it, 180 miles out of it. If I then do that in the cold weather, that reduces again 20 or 30%. So that's where lithium starts to really fall down. Whereas hydrogen, it doesn't care, right? It's not bothered by the cold and climate. So what we find, talking about another project of ours at the very north of the British Isles in Inverness, in the Scottish Highlands, we're building out a network up through there. And weirdly, what surprised us is that there was a lot more demand, or there has been a lot more interest from light goods vehicle operators. People who've got a white van that they drive around, they do, a trade service for someone. They might work for the water body, they might work for a power company, but they have to drive pretty big distances in cold, mountainous climates. And a lot of the fleets have tried battery electric up there, and they don't work because they can't get the right distance out of them. They suffer in the cold. and they can't turn up to their customer and say, "Can I plug in and charge up, please?" or "I'm going to have to stay overnight." That's
Yeah.
not going to work. So that's another reason why I think we'll find different uses for it. And my gut feeling is we're going to see, we're going to replace petrol and diesel with probably 3 or 4 different solutions. I don't think there's going to be just 2 again. But we've never had just one. Remember, we've always had petrol and we've always had diesel. Different uses for different applications. And we'll see the same going forward, I'm sure.
Yeah, I personally I agree on that, because as you just alluded to, the applications or the use cases themselves are so different. How are you able to be able to stuff everything under one solution? There was just a question from the audience I'd like to forward. What's in your point of view, what's the biggest challenge these days for hydrogen?
Yeah, everyone refers to this as the chicken and egg problem. I can build a hydrogen production facility. The technology is extremely well proven. The facilities are out there and available, everything else behind it. And I can get a low cost of hydrogen production that will be pretty close to diesel costs today. But I need to produce that at a pretty large volume in order to do that. Because the bigger the facility, the more efficiencies I'm getting out of it, right? So I need if I want to drive that price down so that people don't have to increase their costs for fuel, I have to build a bigger piece of equipment. The problem with that then is I need to sell it all, right? So that big piece of equipment cost me a hell of a lot of money, tens of millions. And I'm going to divide that capital that I spend, in addition to all of the costs for the electricity I need to buy and water and everything else. But the capital, I'm going to have to recover that capital out of the kilograms of hydrogen that I'm selling. If I'm only selling a very small amount of hydrogen, then I have to charge a lot in each kilogram of hydrogen to pay back that capital. Otherwise, my maths doesn't work. So what I need to do is have demand that I can feel confident, that my investors can feel confident about, that says there's enough people who want to buy this hydrogen, that total design that I've got is going to be used pretty close to capacity, and means I can then say I can spread that cost amongst lots of people, and that helps drive the price down pretty dramatically. So the primary issue around hydrogen is not, is the technology available? It's not, is the supply chain too weak? People talk about electrolyzers not being available. Yeah, there's lots of challenges with that, but that's not the issue. The issue is fundamentally we need demand. So one of the things that we're often talking to governments about, and they're saying, what's the next thing you want us to do to help stimulate the hydrogen economy? Do you need more capital support? Do you need more OPEX support? And weirdly, I'm one of the ones out there advocating, stop trying to give me money. Give it to the truck operator. The vehicles at the moment are super expensive. And they're super expensive for a really simple reason. It's not like they've got some onboard, diamond plated something. The fuel cell itself and all of the componentry for it is really quite simple. A fuel cell vehicle has got 600 moving parts. A diesel engine's got 6,000 moving parts. So why is it more expensive? Well, because we've been making diesel engines for 120 years and we're bloody good at it. But when we come down to fuel cell electrics, they're hand making these things like a Rolls Royce. You've got not just a factory worker working on it. You've got the engineer that invented the damn thing bolting it together, right, on all of their salaries and everything else. No robotic automation, all of that. That's why they're expensive. So if those vehicles at the moment, until you've got a manufacturing chain that's at the level of efficiency that we're now seeing out of the EV OEMs, then we're going to see those vehicles be more expensive. What we need is the governments to step forward and fund the difference in those costs so that there is enough demand for those vehicles that then the OEMs will then start tooling up, creating a factory to build those things efficiently. And then my opinion is that it's not only going to be then coming in line with the cost of a diesel tractor, but actually potentially lower than that because they're simpler. You don't need a gearbox. You don't need to have, all this servicing of all of these moving parts associated with the combustion cycle. It's much, much simpler. So I think in that regard, the future potentially is quite bright there. But the reason why we're not getting there at the moment is the vehicles are not really available, and they're not cost effective at this point in time.
Hence, as you already mentioned, the demand for the hydrogen solutions are missing or it's not as where it could and should be probably.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other point, Christoph, that's interesting to think about. One of the journeys I've been on in this latest entrepreneurial business, when I come to finance my facilities, my financiers want me to say that I'm going to spend X amount of money, and I've got an appropriate amount under long-term contract, the life of the asset, committed for offtake. Now, then you go and have a chat with a trucking company. Go to a logistics company and say, how do you buy your fuel, mate? Do you go out there and bunker 5 years worth of diesel? And they're like, well, no. Do you bunker a week's worth of diesel? And most of them will be no. Most of them will say, no, our drivers have got a fuel card and they stop off at whatever a fuel station that they want to stop at, usually because they've got one that's selling some kind of greasy burger that they like more than the other one. So, it's a preference-based thing, right? It's not right. Economic optimization. It's not for whatever. It's convenience. So, if they've got a favorite haunt that they like to stop at, that's where they refuel. So that means that for me, I'm not going to get that as a customer for long-term committed offtake. So it's the spot market. And then I've got to look at this and say, in order to make that facility at that scale that I'm talking about, I've now got to hope that there's enough customers out there that are going to choose my greasy spoon to buy the burger from instead of another one. And that's a pretty difficult one to square up, actually. So that's another challenge, and it comes down to the financing structures for my projects, for my assets, and how that misaligns potentially with the business models of the customer.
Wow, that's really a view that it doesn't get shared that often. At least for me, it's the first time I hear it that way. So again, but that's exactly why I do the podcast and why I do the show. Because I'm sure I'm not the only one hearing this and going like, wow, really? Oh my goodness, and that's really cool. I just see Jose post another question. How can hydrogen be used in power generation and as a form of energy storage?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jose. Right. So first off, let's just make one sort of statement. And it's kind of picky about this, but what we want to think about hydrogen is not as a source of energy, right? It's not like we pull hydrocarbons out the ground and they're a high energy molecule, so we can just use them. We're creating hydrogen from something that's already stable and producing it. So it is an energy storage thing, essentially. And we're storing that energy in the form of a molecule. And that's what we're doing. So now we get that hydrogen molecule out there. Could we use it in power generation? Absolutely. You can use a lot of the gas-fired power stations today can receive a blend of hydrogen in with the methane mix. So you could then use gas turbines. And then the next generation will be able to do that potentially at 100%. Combusting hydrogen is possible. You can use also hydrogen combustion engines, and they're out there now. They're essentially diesel conversions. So there's another source for it. One of the downsides is the hydrogen burns at quite a high temperature, and so you end up producing a lot of NOx, the nitrogen oxides that you don't like, that are bad for the environment. But you can clean that up with catalytic converters, of course, so that we can manage that. But you can generate power from it. You can also generate power from a mix of hydrogen and ammonia. That's another interesting solution. So then you kind of get a blend of both. And the numbers I'd heard, which don't quote me on this, but 95% ammonia, 5% hydrogen, and you can run some of these devices. So that's an interesting one. Okay. But the other aspect I think Jose pointed out there that's really interesting is energy storage. So let's just talk a bit about the electrical system that we have in the world. There is no such thing as substantial energy storage in any grid on the planet. Put it in context. Okay, so the biggest one that you might have heard about was deployed by Tesla in South Australia, and it was this world scale battery farm that was there to store energy because South Australia was having real issues with its energy supply. So the scale of that thing, it's 150 megawatt output, and it has 185 megawatt hours of storage. So that basically means it can provide 150 megawatts of power for about 80 minutes, and then it's dead. It's got nothing left. So it's irrelevant. And when you say irrelevant, 150 megawatts, a small gas-fired peaker station that responds quickly to demands on the grid will generate about 400 megawatts. So that battery system on the scale of grids is just irrelevant. And yet that made world headlines when it got deployed. Hydrogen, though, you can create huge volumes of it, and we could store it underground quite safely in reservoirs like we do today with gas storage, either in porous rocks where we get most of the hydrocarbons in the world from, or in salt caverns. Germany's got a lot of those. I used to work for Wintershall, and they have a gas storage facility up in the north of Germany in the salt caverns. So you could do it in those regards. And then what you can do is sort of bank power. And when we go forward away from using coal and gas and oil and so on for producing electricity, we're going to need energy storage. The reason for that is that the wind doesn't always blow. It's nighttime at least half the time. Then we've got, particularly in Britain, a whole lot of clouds. So solar and wind is not the most reliable. And yet people want to use power when they want to use power. And electrical grids around the entire world have been designed the same way. It's a super simple technology. You could plug in a device into your PowerPoint at home, and you would have as much information as the national grid needs to determine whether they need to turn on more power generation or less. And it's simply the frequency of the oscillations of your alternating power. When lots of people are pulling power off, that frequency starts to fall down, so they put more generation on. If that starts to speed up, it means no one's using, or less people are using power, so they'd slow down some of that generation. That used to be super easy. You'd have a huge coal-fired power station. In fact, you'd be spinning these giant drums at great velocity. And that spinning inertia was a form of energy storage. And then when they needed more power, they'd throw more, essentially bars across magnets over it. That would start generating electricity and slow that down a bit. And then they'd just chuck more coal on. We're not going to have that in the future, right? So everyone's rushing to figure out how we're going to do energy storage. So, there's concepts of like gravity structures and actually spinning inertia structures. And both of those things have actually got some serious safety challenges. Spoke about batteries. They're not going to be the solution. They're not going to be big enough. And pumped hydro is probably the only real significant form of energy storage on the planet today. But that's actually really environmentally bad, because you've essentially got one lake uphill and one lake downhill, and nothing gets delivered into the lake because you're going to empty the thing constantly, right? So unless you're pumping the fish downhill and back up again, it doesn't work for your trout. So, but the hydrogen is a really important angle for that, and I think they're going to see that as a way of storing energy. But again, I think the interesting question is that going to be pure hydrogen, or are we going to create a easier to store e-fuel from the hydrogen? Maybe that's another option. So I don't know. I don't know the right answer to that one.
Awesome. But nevertheless, I mean, there is a lot to grasp, to hear, to think about, and that's all why I'm doing this podcast. It's fantastic. It's really great. Maybe because we are almost about to wrap this thing up, maybe one last question, Lou. Can you give us a brief information about H2 Green's role in the whole hydrogen discussion?
Yeah, thanks, Christoph. Happy to. So H2 Green is a hydrogen developer. So what that means is that we go out and we locate where we're going to create a hydrogen facility. We actually use a lot of technology that was used in oil and gas for finding oil fields, in that we use a lot of spatial analytics to figure it out. So I spoke to you, we talked throughout this podcast around how vehicles moving is, there are different use cases in different locations. There's considerations for infrastructure, considerations for planning approvals, all of those kinds of things. So we map all of those things together, and X marks the spot. That's the place where we can go and build a hydrogen facility. And then my job is to move that forward into an investment ready proposition. So I go through, build up the customer base, get the contracts for the customers, start doing the front end engineering design for for that work. So we outsource that to an EPC who will do those engineering studies for us. And then we've got a project that's essentially bundled up, ready to go. And we can either raise the capital and fund it, or we can sell that project as a bundle to someone else, usually an infrastructure type investor, who will come through, and they won't take the front risk, but they'll take the project execution risk. And in return for that, I'll get a fee associated with that. And so that's a very commonplace for a group like H2 Green to do. It happens all the time in wind and solar, and that's an emerging sort of business that's coming through in the hydrogen space. And then, on occasion, we'll stay in that asset and produce long-term revenues by producing and selling hydrogen on the longer term.
Excellent. Now, Luke, maybe one last question. If some of the listeners are now, oh man, maybe they are a trucking company and they are thinking about, hey, yeah, I have the demand, or maybe there's just someone interested in learning more about that, and maybe they have a proposal for you. How can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm pretty active on Twitter. It's Luke at H2 Green, or at Luke_H2Green, I think. Can't remember my handle anymore. LinkedIn, but also, tell you what, just easiest, drop me an email. It's luke@h2green.co.uk. I'd happily pick up a conversation with people. And always interested in jumping on these talks as well, Christoph. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Once again, thank you for your time, for being here, and for sharing this amazing information. I appreciate it, Luke. And with that being said, I'm wishing you a fantastic evening. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks very much, Christoph. See you later.
You're welcome. See you later. Bye-bye.